Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a viral trend that has a lot of parents and teachers asking, what is going on? It all starts with a simple hand gesture and two numbers, but it leads down a rabbit hole that, according to our source, is way darker than it looks on the surface.
You've probably seen this popping up on your social media feeds, right? Kids and teens making this very specific hand gesture while chanting the numbers 6-7. At first glance, it just seems like another piece of harmless, chaotic internet fun. But our source for today's explainer argues there's actually a pretty deliberate design behind all of it. So, let's dive in.
The source we're looking at today is a podcast called Strange Encounters, and they decided to investigate this whole thing because the trend just felt a little off. The host had a hunch that even if it looked like kids just being silly, there was probably something more going on right under the surface.
Okay, so where did this all begin? If you do a quick search online, you'll find one very popular explanation. But our source argues that to find the real origin story, you gotta look past the meme.
So, the story that's floating around is that the trend is all about a meme about a 6'7" basketball player. But the source says that's not the whole picture. They claim the meme just helped the trend go viral, while the true origin, the real root of it all, is actually a hip-hop song that came out first.
And this is where the investigation really shifts gears. The source moves past the surface layer meme and starts to focus directly on the artist behind the music that they allege started this whole thing.
All right, Section 2, the artist behind the song. According to a pastor named Nathan Bentley, who's featured pretty heavily in the source material, if you take a closer look at the artist, Skrilla, what you find is, well, what he describes as a much, much darker narrative.
Now, the podcast is super clear on this. These points you're seeing here, they aren't just speculation or rumors. They claim this information is coming directly from the artist's own interviews, where he's apparently very open and transparent about his spiritual beliefs and his practices.
The source points to these alleged practices as being absolutely key to understanding the artist's motivations. But the thing that the podcast host finds most alarming is a very specific, and honestly, a very strange creative choice that was made inside the song itself.
Yeah, this is the question that the source says is the biggest red flag of all. The song itself is described as having really adult themes, But then mixed right into it is an unmistakable sample from Baby Shark, a song that every little kid on the planet knows.
And this right here really illustrates the core of the podcast's entire concern. They believe this wasn't an accident. They argue that a super familiar children's tune was intentionally embedded inside a song with mature themes and these dark spiritual claims, basically creating a gateway for a much younger audience.
Okay, next up, Section 3, a religion called Santeria. Now, to give some context for the artist's alleged practices, the source gives us a quick overview of Santeria, which is the religion the artist is said to follow.
According to the source, this religious framework is the key to understanding the artist's motivations and what they claim is the spiritual power behind his music.
The podcast explains that these orishas are kind of like lesser deities. You could compare them to angels or demons. They act as intermediaries, and followers reportedly make offerings to them to gain favor, get protection, or even, according to the source, to cause harm to their enemies.
So here's the crucial connection the source makes. These alleged practices are, they claim, directly linked to the music that is now morphed into this massive viral trend that's so popular with kids.
So with all that context now established, the podcast host pivots from just explaining things to a direct warning, focusing on what he sees as the spiritual implications for children and their families.
The host uses this analogy to really frame his argument. He basically says, look, you wouldn't let your kids take obvious physical risks like playing with a knife or running out into traffic, right? So, he argues, you should apply that same level of caution to what he describes as spiritual risks.
He then makes his point even more personal by sharing some of his own past experiences as a parent, arguing that underestimating the influence of popular culture can lead to some really serious unintended consequences down the road.
So, the ultimate message from the source is this: there is no neutral ground here. Dismissing the trend as just harmless fun is, in their view, a mistake because it ignores what they claim are its dark and very intentional origins. From their perspective, ignorance doesn't equal innocence. So after laying out all the claims from their investigation, the source leaves listeners with this final question. They frame the 67 trend not as just a simple meme, but as a choice between what seems innocent and what they argue is a potential spiritual risk.
It's a really striking example of how, in the digital age, the line between a harmless trend and a much deeper narrative can get incredibly blurry. And that's all for this explainer.